Much of which had been covered by court filings and the news media since former FBI Director James Comey and Andrew McCabe detailed the FBI's investigation. Yet on Thursday, moments before the redacted report was released, this was Attorney General William Barr's bottom line.
The special counsel found no collusion by any Americans in IRA's illegal activities. There was no evidence of the Trump campaign collusion with the Russian government's hacking. Did not find that the Trump campaign or other Americans colluded in those efforts. No underlying collusion with Russia. There was, in fact, no collusion.
Joining me now is MSNBC contributor Barbara McQuade, MSNBC legal analyst Paul Butler, David Corn, co-author of Russian Roulette, the inside story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump, Naveed Jamali, author of How to Catch a Russian Spy, and David Cay Johnston, author of It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. Thank you all for being here. Let's just go through everybody one by one. I'll start with you, Barbara McQuade. The instances of potential collusion that were outlined in the Mueller report: Donald Trump Jr.'s interactions with WikiLeaks, Jared Kushner's attempts to set up a back channel that American intelligence couldn't hear, Donald Trump's request for Clinton's emails, including publicly, Paul Manafort's briefings with Konstantin Klimnik, the Russian oligarch, on the campaign, including giving him strategic data on their targeting of states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, states Trump ultimately won narrowly. Here's what Mueller writes in the report about this idea of collusion. We applied the framework of conspiracy law, not the concept of collusion, noting, quote, collusion is not a specific offense or theory of liability, and that this office focused on conspiracy as defined in federal law. Why, Barbara McQuade, would those multiple contacts and then lies about those contacts with Russian officials and sharing campaign data with Russian officials not be conspiracy?
What Robert Mueller was looking at was a very narrow definition of a crime. In some ways, it really is a little bit of a fool's errand for a prosecutor to try to analyze a president's misconduct through the lens of criminal law, because Robert Mueller concludes that he cannot charge a sitting president. And so in some ways, this was not really the appropriate lens. But looking through that lens, it did not meet the technical definition, the elements of the offense of conspiracy, which requires an agreement. That's the essence of conspiracy. Instead, what he found is mutually beneficial activities that were going on and responding and reacting to each other. And so although he found no precise crime of conspiracy, I think all Americans should be deeply troubled by all of the efforts that went on to share information and mutually benefit each other. And certainly it is an issue for Congress to take up as to whether this is conduct befitting a sitting president of the United States.
Yeah, indeed, Paul Butler. I mean, the idea that any American, let alone a group of them, would see the advantage in an adversarial foreign power handing them dirt on their political opponents. And I think for a lot of Americans, what they don't understand is how that can possibly be legal. Let's read a little bit again from the Mueller report. It says that although the investigation established that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and that the campaign expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in election interference activities. A couple of examples of Trump campaign promoting political materials that the Internet Research Agency and that the GRU stole. And here it is. Don Jr., Eric Trump, Kellyanne Conway, Brad Parscale, and Michael Flynn all cited or retweeted IRA-controlled Twitter accounts that were trying to disseminate information to throw discord or sow discord within the American electorate. And according on WikiLeaks, according to Rick Gates, who's pleaded out, Paul Manafort expressed excitement about the release of WikiLeaks through WikiLeaks of GRU stolen emails. For his part, told the office that shortly after WikiLeaks' July 22 release, Manafort also spoke with the candidate Trump, and he also wanted to be kept apprised of any developments with WikiLeaks, and separately told Gates to keep in touch about future WikiLeaks releases. They obviously wanted those releases to come out. They promoted them. They retweeted them. Why is that not conspiracy?
You know, Joy, I think a bold, gutsy prosecutor would have charged President Trump with conspiracy to defraud the United States. Bob Mueller is not that prosecutor. He's very cautious. He only brings cases that are slam dunks, which is why he wins all of his cases. But on the other hand, when you have this kind of evidence, if I were prosecuting the case, my opening statement would have started, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, when President Trump learned that there was an investigation, he didn't say that's crazy, but I'm glad because my good name will be cleared. What he said is if there's a criminal investigation of me for working with the Russians to get elected, then that's the end of my presidency. I'm effed. That's not what an innocent person says, and that's exactly why he got so busy obstructing the investigation those 10 different times, because he was properly concerned that if there was a thorough investigation of his efforts to work with the Russians to get elected, that he would be in deep trouble.
Yeah, and you know, David Corn, you've written extensively about this, obviously all the way going back from the Steele memo on. And fundamentally, what the Steele memo was getting at was that Donald Trump had a pecuniary interest in working with Russia, meaning a financial interest. He was easy to target because he had so many reasons to want to cuddle up to Moscow. And then on the other side of it, you have Paul Manafort, who's doing these backdoor deals to try to do a quote-unquote Ukrainian peace deal that essentially would allow Russia to seize Crimea, to keep Crimea and let the United States okay that. And then in exchange for that, here's another part of the Mueller report. The plan later, Manafort later acknowledged, this peace plan that was being floated constituted a backdoor means for Russia to control eastern Ukraine. Second, Manafort briefed Konstantin Kilimnik, this Russian oligarch, on the state of the Trump campaign and Manafort's plan to win the election. That briefing encompassed the campaign's messaging, its internal polling data. According to Gates, it also included a discussion of battleground states, which Manafort identified as Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. We know that at the same time this was happening, Russia was interfering in the electoral processes of states. They were going after voter rolls. They were trying to manipulate the election on the ground. All of this together constitutes a campaign that was at least cooperating with and open to a foreign government doing all sorts of things to manipulate the election.
Well, let me try to get a big picture here, because the report is long, there are a lot of details in it, but it shows that throughout the campaign, Trump and his associates had weird, puzzling, strange, and improper interactions with Russians while the Russians were attacking the United States, even after it was reported in the press that the Russians were behind the hacks targeting the Democratic Party. And what do these interactions do? They signal to the Russians that we're willing to play ball with you, that we don't mind this. And then you attach that to what they were saying publicly, Trump and all his campaign people, that the Russians were not attacking. This is the type of collusion, if not direct conspiracy. They were engaged, they were helping the Russian cover-up, while, as Mueller says, they were seeking to benefit from the attack. So this is, we have lies and betrayal. And maybe that's crime, maybe that's not a crime, but it is certainly something for the American public to contemplate in terms of profound wrongdoing. And then you have instances like Paul Manafort working to advance Russian interest, or at least discussing that, while running the campaign. And we see in this report, to get particular here, that he lied about that, and they were never able to really determine if he told Donald Trump about these efforts. Same thing with Roger Stone. A lot of interactions, it seems, between Stone and the campaign about what WikiLeaks was doing. So there's still a lot we don't know, but what we do know, steady stream of lies. They try to exploit the attack, and they did everything they could to tell Americans there was no attack.
Yeah.
I don't know what you need for a gigantic scandal more than that.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, Naveed, and you and I have talked about this a lot. I mean, you've been approached by Russians in the past. You've written about it. There's a thing that Americans do when they're approached by an adversarial foreign power who wants something from them, right? And it's not what any of these people did. None of these people called the FBI. None of these people alerted officials, even when they were told, wait a minute, by the way, Russia is attempting to interfere in this election, told that by the federal government. Here's some of the things that they did. After candidate Trump stated on July 27, 2016, that he hoped Russia would find the 30,000 emails that were missing, Trump asked individuals officially affiliated with his campaign to find the deleted Clinton emails. Michael Flynn, who would later serve as National Security Advisor, recalled that Trump made this request repeatedly. Flynn subsequently contacted multiple people and attempted to obtain the emails. Okay, fine. They're domestically looking for the emails. But when you have Russians saying that they can give them to you, And wouldn't you normally call the FBI? And what should the FBI have done, conversely, to more aggressively stop this from happening?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important question, is understanding the Russian intent. And look, at the key part of this is, if a foreign adversary approaches you, you should pick up the phone and call the FBI. You don't need a law to do that. At least I didn't think we needed a law, but apparently we do, because, you know, morals and ethics don't seem to guide a lot of these people. Just to go back to Russia, I think it's really important to understand what the Russian intent was. Look, they were probing, they were doing what's known as collecting intelligence. So again, that in of itself, targeting someone and speaking to an American citizen and using them to collect intelligence in of itself does not constitute a crime. But if you, as that American, do not pick up the phone and call the FBI, what you are doing is depriving our intelligence community of equivalent actionable intelligence that can tell what an adversary is trying to do to our country. And so, besides the fact that it's not morally right to have discussions with a foreign power about, you know, impacting an election, it also impacts the national security by depriving us of actionable intelligence. And my goodness, these people did this like every day up until the election. It is shocking. And I have to ask, you know, look, I think that there is some blame that lies in the Obama administration, understanding why we didn't react more strongly to disrupt this Russian operation. But Joy, what frightens me today is the fact that if there's questions leading up to 2016 about what our intelligence community did or didn't do to stop this, we are in a worse position today in 2019 than we were in 2016, and that scares the bejesus out of me. I mean, it really, really does.
No, I mean, and to stay with you just for a second, David, you know, I'm reading through the report as well, and I'm at the point now where they're talking about the fact that Russian actors in the GRU were attempting to go after the systems of multiple states' voter rolls, right? And what's been done about that? You had James Comey, who's much pilloried for intervening in the election to essentially throw Hillary Clinton over the side 11 days before the election. What was he doing about this, about the Russians that were actively interfering in the election all throughout the 2016 campaign? Because it doesn't seem like a whole heck of a lot was getting done in that vein.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to make it clear, to disrupt a Russian intelligence operation does not require bringing someone to court, putting them in handcuffs, and doing a perp walk. It could be something as simple as going to Russia and say, we have pictures, we know what you're doing, and the Russians would stop. Look, the Russians are terrified of direct confrontation. And the thing that confounds me is exactly that question. What was James Comey doing in the lead up to this? Why? Again, it doesn't require necessarily legal matters. We're not talking about U.S. persons. We're talking about Russian intelligence officers. You very simply could have let the Russians know that we knew what they were up to, and that probably would have disrupted their operations. They would have stopped because they would not have wanted to risk escalation. And I do not understand to this day why that wasn't done. It doesn't seem to have been done. And one final thought, very quickly on that. When we talk about things like swing states, and we start seeing the Russians targeting those swing states with disinformation, that is not a concept that Russia understands. That means, in my book, Joy, that someone on the American side was telling the Russians that, and again, it may not have constituted a crime, but that is collection. That is Russian intelligence collecting something.
Paul Manafort, we have here from the Mueller report. Paul Manafort was telling them. Yeah.
Exactly. Paul Manafort had that meeting with Constance Kilimnik where it was like tit for tat. Paul Manafort said, you got our private campaign data. You know how we're doing in various states. What do you think? And in exchange, Constance Kilimnik said, well, you know, if Trump gets elected, then this is what he could do for the Ukraine. This is what he could do for us. Again, I think a bolder prosecutor would have found abundant evidence of conspiracy to defraud enough to make a case.
And you know, I'm going to go to David Cay Johnston quickly, but in addition to that, you have WikiLeaks' Julian Assange saying, hey, we'd rather have Trump win. Here's why. And then going out and saying, hey, why don't you, Guccifer, release that stuff through us? You have all these actors saying we need Trump in there, and here's what we're going to do toward it, and yet no conspiracy cases. I want to go to you, David Cay Johnston, because in addition to asking why would any American who cares about this country cooperate in such an effort for electoral gain, right? And why would everyone around him and no one say, don't do that? That doesn't sound very patriotic. Why are you doing that? So no one stopped it. Everyone participated. But then once Trump gets in, now he's in. On March 25th, 2017, 3 days after a meeting in the Oval Office, the President of the United States calls in Dan Coats, who's a DNI, and again complains, not about Russia intrusion in the election, not about what was done to this country, but about the investigations, saying words to the effect of, I can't do anything with Russia. There's things I'd like to do with Russia, with trade, with ISIS, and they're all over me with this. What kind of a guy does that?
Well, the head of a white-collar crime family who spent his entire life as the third-generation head of a criminal organization. And that's what Donald Trump has run, just as his father did when he was business partners with mob guys, including Willie Tomasello, and his grandfather did when he started out illegally coming into the country as a draft dodger, illegally getting his citizenship as a German draft dodger, and then running whorehouses to build the Trump fortune, the first Trump fortune. Donald Trump's behavior here is very consistent with someone who knows that law enforcement is onto them, and they've got to figure out how to get them off. And lo and behold, he's the head of the whole law enforcement operation. The Mueller report, Joy, makes it eminently clear there was collusion. There was trafficking both ways. There was a willingness to accept. There was the provision of information to the Russians. How successful or unsuccessful with it is totally irrelevant. Clearly, Mueller feels, contrary to Paul Butler's analysis, that it doesn't rise to the level of a criminal conspiracy charge you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But that's not the standard under our Constitution. Our Constitution is absolute loyalty and fidelity to America, not divided loyalties, and faithful execution of the office. And so the grounds here to remove Donald Trump are overwhelming. What there isn't is the political support to do so, because we have a bunch of cowards in the U.S. Senate who are unwilling to do what they know to be right for fear of losing their jobs. And all I can say to you is, if after 1 million people died for this country, you won't do your duty because you might be voted out in the primary, you don't deserve to hold any public office.
Yeah, and Barbara McQuaid, the Mueller report reads like a cross between The Plot to Hack America, the books by David K. Johnston and David Corn that we have here. We've been talking about this for 3 years, the things that were done. Everyone knows what was done. There's plenty of reporting on it. The Mueller report simply reinforces what we've heard. If that is not illegal, then what good is the criminal justice system if all of that is, at least according to the Mueller report, perfectly legal to do?
So I think it's important to understand what's legal and what's improper and might be unfit for a sitting president. Robert Mueller was only looking to see whether crimes were committed. It's a very narrow limitation on behavior, that which we want to punish someone criminally by taking away their liberty and putting them in prison. That is very different from deciding whether someone is fit to serve as president of the United States. And so he has laid out in great detail what is contained there, and I think it is now for Congress to look at that conduct and decide whether this is someone who's fit to serve as president. From a counterintelligence perspective, I completely agree that the idea of sharing polling data for battleground states to an entity, a foreign adversary that is attacking our elections, is something that is incredibly unpatriotic, and although it may not specifically fit that narrow definition of a crime, it is something that certainly fits perhaps the definition of impeachment. I live in one of those battleground states of Michigan. I think there's been a lot of focus on the hacking operation and not enough focus on the social media influence operation. If Russia knows that Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota are the places to focus on, how many more social media memes did they send into those states to try to influence voters in those states, which may have worked?
Yeah, and Paul Butler targeting at Black Lives Matter, pretending and impersonating Black Lives Matter activists, going in and trying to reduce the African-American vote, and lo and behold, Hillary Clinton only gets 88% of the African-American vote. I mean, the influence campaign doesn't get talked about enough, but even participating in that, do we actually have to pass laws telling American citizens that it should be illegal to cooperate with a foreign power? Is that how far we've fallen, to reiterate my question from the last hour?
You know what Russia was doing was straight out of the Trump campaign playbook. How do you win an election? You sow racial discord. You get African Americans and white people all up in arms against each other. It was so granular, Joy, what the Russians were doing, that they had a different category for Black LGBT people and white LGBT people. Again, they're not making this up. They're getting this information from Trump. He was giving them marching orders on the day that he made that speech. Russia, if you're listening, I sure would like to find those 30,000 missing Hillary emails. That's the very same day, Joy, that the Mueller team tells us that for the first time, the Russians hacked Hillary's private email, or at least tried to.
And David Corn, do Democrats understand how profound this was and how dangerous it is and that it could happen again?
I hope so. I think so. I'm not sure the American public does, and I'm not sure most Republicans out there understand this. I mean, the basic fact here, right? Russia attacked the American election with information warfare, with targeting particular candidates, and that part of their aim was to help Trump get elected. They succeeded. They were able to succeed in part because Trump helped them get away with it by denying the attack was happening.
Yeah.
These are the essentials we knew before the Mueller report, but the Mueller report really puts it center stage for the country and the Congress to deal with.
Absolutely. Yeah, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, didn't they, with the help of some friendly Americans.